Welcome to Ziffity Quick Chat.
The choice between open source and SaaS is usually almost a philosophical one. I cannot subcontract out ownership of that data, that customer data, maybe to a third party. I have to have it myself. It's really better suited for, I would say, upper mid-market and enterprise brands because of the technical complexity that Headless implies.
Hi, folks. I'm Mackenzie Floyd from Ziffity Digital. Welcome to our podcast channel, Ziffity Quick Chat. The topic for today is how combining SaaS and headless commerce can enable e-commerce success. Customer experience matters the most for any business and especially for e-commerce. Well, why? Because e-commerce mutated from just a transactional website to a digital experience that provides the pleasure of shopping. Customer experience drives e-commerce, and getting it right is a high priority for any e-commerce business, no matter how big or small they are. In pursuit of achieving it, e-commerce brands have faced two major challenges for years. The first, they're unable to customize because of the rigidity of the platforms that they use and heavy development time and cost involved in customizing these experiences. Headless has chipped in and it's changed the scene for good. Headless commerce has really turned the dream of an e-commerce business having a great customer experience and top-notch technicalities into a reality. In this podcast, we'll be interacting with Aaron Sheehan. He's the Director of Competitive Strategy at BigCommerce. During our interaction, we're going to uncover how combining a SaaS e-commerce platform with a headless commerce approach will benefit a business and all the nitty-gritty involved. If you're an e-commerce brand using or looking to go for a SaaS platform, hopefully this podcast will answer a lot of your pressing questions. Hey, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for joining. Can you just give us some background on your experience in e-commerce and, a little bit about your role at BigCommerce?
Sure. So I've been in the e-commerce space for about 8 years, mostly on the agency side. So I guess competing against Ziffity at some level, potentially. Worked pretty heavily with Magento, all the way back to Magento 1 and Magento 2, worked with Salesforce Commerce Cloud, Shopify, and actually BigCommerce as a partner building websites for merchants. About 6 months ago, made the jump over to BigCommerce to step in as their Director of Competitive Strategy.
Awesome. Perfect. So you're the perfect person for us to ask some questions to.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I have a lot of opinions. So if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yep. So let's just get into it. What is headless commerce?
That's a pretty great question and more complicated than a lot of people think it is. And part of that is because there's a lot of buzzword sort of stew going on right now in the space. So if you go back a few years, headless was being used to describe generally like an e-commerce build where I might have had like a content management system, a separate content management system serving my pages and my front end that was decoupled from my backend where my product data, my order data, my transactional engine was. So you would see, for instance, WordPress as a pretty common front end with Magento in the back or something like that. And they would be integrated with one another. But you basically had headless was the adjective to describe Magento in that mode of deployment where there was no hedge to Magento. It was purely supplying data to WordPress or Acquia or Drupal or Adobe Experience Manager, prefiguring the later Adobe acquisition. As the landscape has matured, you see people take the position that headless, when describing a system, it's the same. It means that there is no head to it, but maybe there is not even there's a headless CMS or a headless front end, something like a Prismic on the front, where it's not even a full DXP or CMS. I'm building my pages basically and pulling the data from different systems to populate the different pages and experiences that I'm building on the site. So that's not to be confused with composable, which has sort of snuck in as a new industry term. So composable is sometimes used interchangeably with headless. Really, if you think of headless as a good word to describe the e-com or the system, so I have a headless e-commerce system. Composable is the word for the deployment of multiple headless systems or API first systems in an entire stack. So in a composable like environment, I might have a separate search and merch service running from a separate CMS content service running separately from a PIM, etc. Right? And so there are lots and lots of other buzzwords. I highly recommend checking out some industry publications. IDC and Gartner and Forrester all do quite a bit of thought leadership in this area. And there are plenty more terms and acronyms out there that we can get into. But pretty quickly, at a glance, headless just means my front end and my back end are on different systems.
That's a really great explanation. Thank you so much. So why should an e-commerce brand think of combining SaaS and headless?
So there are two sort of like primary reasons that I see merchants express interest in headless solutions for their e-commerce site. And the first one is, I would say, familiarity with the front end. So sometimes you will have a merchandising and marketing team at a merchant that is really used to a particular front-end tool, like a WordPress or an Adobe Experience Manager or Bloomreach, or like there's any number of possible front ends. And so they want to have improve their e-commerce experience. Maybe they're trying to move away from on-premise software. Maybe they have, they're on something that's been end of life, either explicitly or not explicitly by the vendor. And they want to keep what they like, which is the front end that they are used, that serves them well, but they need to replace the plumbing underneath it. So it's like, I've got my house, I love my house, but the plumbing needs to switch. It's old iron pipes and I need to switch it to PVC, right? Like that's one reason why merchants will often talk about a headless deployment. The other one is when they want more control and freedom over their front end than a tightly coupled monolithic e-commerce platform will give them. Then you see this a lot, I think, more in the fashion or health and beauty space, where it's very brand first, very heavy design. So there's a lot of like redesigning with new line, like a new summer line or new spring line. I may totally want to redo my homepage and my landing pages as a result. That can be a challenge if you are in a very highly opinionated e-commerce platform that kind of like says, here's the template, you must sort of fit your site layout into this, and departing from that causes a lot of angst and pain. Sometimes a merchant will say, I want the freedom to basically have the choice to decide what the templates and layouts are going to be on my site, because my business and my brand depends on being constantly iterating on my look and my feel. So there are other reasons that people might be looking to avoid vendor lock-in. Maybe they simply, for contractual reasons or business reasons, don't want all their eggs in one basket. They don't want their entire primary web channel to be dependent on one single vendor. They want to spread that out. That's another reason. But usually it's because they either like what they have today on the front end and want to change the back end, or because they can't find a monolith that allows them to be as creative as they want to be with the front.
Right. Makes perfect sense. So with that said, do you think it's better to go for an open source CMS or custom build the front end, in the headless SaaS approach?
It's a hard question. You're going to hear it depends for me a lot, because there really aren't simple answers to a lot of these questions. It depends a lot on who you are as a merchant, right? Where we see where I've seen historically, I've been on the open source side for a long time. The merchants that make that work are ones who have a mature technical team on staff or on retainer through an agency, and they are comfortable with that team and the sort of the expense that incurs, because with great freedom comes great responsibility, right? And so if you have that level of freedom, then that means you are going to be on the hook. If I'm using an open source CMS, maybe I have to host it, I have to maintain it. If I'm using a SaaS-based CMS, that kind of goes away. If I'm not using a CMS and I'm just building everything from scratch myself, I'm gonna have to pay somebody to do that, obviously, because every time I need a page, I'm gonna have to call a developer to go build that page. But I see very few merchants actually want to go that route. Usually there's some kind of front end as a service or CMS or DXP somewhere in the mix that's being worked with. The choice between open source and SaaS is usually almost a philosophical one for the merchant to make, depending on what they're more comfortable with. Do I like owning and then having to like pay maintenance, or do I like leasing and not having to pay the maintenance? Is a lot of times how that comes down to it. There also may be regulatory and compliance reasons. If I'm in a highly regulated industry, I may have like, intrusive compliance and security and auditing needs that I need to own. I need to have my own databases. I need to run everything myself in-house, because I have to sort of like, I cannot subcontract out ownership of that data, that customer data, maybe to a third party. I have to have it myself. I've had those conversations a few times as well. So sometimes SaaS simply legally or regulatorily will not work for a particular merchant. Got it.
Yeah, there's a whole host of reasons why why that wouldn't work. So you mentioned fashion. What other types of e-commerce businesses do you think should go for the headless commerce approach?